out probably for a long time. That would have been pretty embarrassing then and now. But there are several teaching moments in this gospel. One, Jesus clearly had siblings. He had brothers and sisters. Two, his family, including his mother, thought he was stark raving mad. And Jesus was clearly, very clearly estranged from his family. Third, his family's lack of acceptance made him regard those who followed the will of God as his family. And he even set some distance between he and his family. You know, he lived in Capernaum and they lived in Nazareth. And this is why Jesus said a prophet is not accepted in his own town. Well, apparently, really not in his own family either. So the door to the Mary Joseph family will remain forever closed to us, despite the pretty stories handed down to us throughout the generations about the three-membered, perfectly peaceful and serene Holy Family who were more like angels rather than flesh and blood people. But according to this gospel and snippets in others, these pretty stories are pretty much myths. Jesus and his family, like our families, did not live in perfect joy and serenity, and his mother was an early critic and hardly his best friend. The truth is that Jesus's preaching really upset his family. And we really don't know the reason, but perhaps when you put things in context, there's always a reason for why something happens. Perhaps his family, or I would say his family, did remember the carnage that resulted from the revolt of Judas the Galilean in 6 of the Common Era, when Romans crucified 2,000 men, women, and children and left their dying bodies nailed to crosses along the road, which would have led to Nazareth, where his family lived. This was a surefire way of putting fear into the hearts of the family of Jesus and into everyone else. Prudent folk would not even think of upsetting the Romans. So it is small wonder that they came to seize him and take him home before he antagonized the occupying forces, who would roll over them without a moment's notice if they thought their power was challenged. Of course, Jesus later on did do things that would upset both the religious and the imperial authorities. And at least 2 members of his family, his mother and his brother James, followed him, James apparently to his death. The Gospel of Philip states that there were always 3 women who walked with Jesus: Mary Magdalene, his maternal aunt, and his mother. In the Gospel of John, both his mother and Mary Magdalene, who is the real beloved disciple, stood at the foot of the cross. And his mother is listed as being present at the first Pentecost in Acts of the Apostles. And Jesus's brother James led the small group of proto-Christians after Jesus died, not Peter. He was called James the Just because he was said to have developed calluses on his knees from spending so many hours in prayer. And while there were no bishops in the early church, James was later regarded as the first bishop of Jerusalem. And he is reported to have been stoned to death on the orders of the high priest somewhere in the 60s. The gospel verses today are often used to show that Jesus put his family behind him in order to do God's work. That to be chosen by God alone means to walk alone without being encumbered with the people of God, or even with your own family for that matter. But of course, we know Jesus never walked alone. While he might have been estranged from his family at some point in time, he had found many friends and followers to accompany him on his journey, as was mentioned in the gospel today. And while Jesus might have gone off to pray alone, as many of us do, he hardly led a monkish, solitary life. So the word chosen, being chosen, has always carried a lot of baggage. And folks are chosen for all sorts of things. So I'll be a proud grandma and say that my 7th grade granddaughter, Amelia, was chosen to receive the Empathy Award at an assembly where her classmates cheered for her. And likewise, people are chosen for leadership positions. However, those sorts of choices indicate that a person has met certain requirements and characteristics that made the selection possible. Choosing yourself to accomplish what is most likely a personal goal and attributing your choice to divine will is fraught with all sorts of problems. And we are seeing that alleged divine choice being played out by authoritarian countries and authoritarian leaders. And so we need to ask ourselves, if God, the creator of all the heavens and the earth and everything in it, has ever elected a nation or a people to be most favored by the divine, has the creator God ever chosen presidential candidates or popes or a winning side in a battle? Jesus, like the Jewish prophets before him, says no. We are not God's people by birth or by divine selection, but rather by our commitment to act justly and ethically. Membership in God's people and Jesus' extended family requires our actions to mirror the actions of God, whose mandate is, of course, that we are to love our neighbor as ourselves. With all the inevitable murk surrounding personal choice, how do we know if our choice is the right thing? How do we know that our choice mirrors the will of God? The Apostle Paul told us that following the will of God produces the gifts of the Holy Spirit: wisdom, understanding, counsel, fortitude, knowledge, piety, and also the fruits of the Holy Spirit: love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, gentleness, goodness, faithfulness, and self-control. If we claim God as our best friend and our choices do not produce these gifts and these fruits, we are committing what Jesus described today as a great sin against the Holy Spirit. And Paul explains Jesus's position in his first letter to the Corinthians. We can be regular churchgoers and receive communion. We can pray for hours on callous knees like James of Jerusalem. We can claim that we are ready to die for our faith, and indeed some people do. We can tell pretty stories about our relationship with God and even insist again and again that God has chosen us to accomplish God's will. But if we don't love, if we quash the gifts of the Holy Spirit, if we forget the least among us, we are not praising God, or I should say pleasing God. But there is good news. Jesus knew that folks could always change, like his mother and his brother. While he fully expects people to follow the will of God, he knew that folks would fail. In another reflection on doing God's will in the Gospel of Matthew, he told his listeners that tax collectors and prostitutes, those most hated in the ancient world, would enter heaven before the righteous who do not love. The Sermon on the Mount, the parables of the Good Samaritan and the prodigal son, the story of the bent-over woman, the woman at the well, and the woman caught in adultery paint Jesus's all-encompassing vision of the world that he described, the world that he described as God's choice for us. It is in these stories, that Jesus explains what his family values are. It is a place where siblings might fight a lot, like mine did, where parents might try to clip the wings of what they regard as a wayward child, where religious values are held up to the light and found wanting. Nevertheless, all is eventually forgiven. There is a role for everyone, and the Holy Spirit guides us through the thicket of life by casting the jewels of our gifts that light up our way.